The history of the toilet doesn't start in a palace or a laboratory. It begins in the mud and stone of ancient cities, where early humans first realized that separating waste from the living space wasn't just about comfort, it was survival. In the earliest permanent settlements, like Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, people built homes from clay and wood, pressed tightly together with no streets and no plumbing. Inside, they slept, ate, worked, and relieved themselves, often in the same space. Archaeologists have found layers of compacted waste beneath living floors, sometimes intentionally sealed under platforms. It was a choice of necessity, not design. But as populations grew, the need to move waste out of the home became urgent. Disease didn't yet have a name, but the consequences of filth were visible. People began digging simple holes outside the home, then trenches, then pits lined with stone. In ancient Mesopotamia, by 2500 BCE, some homes in cities like had clay drain pipes that carried waste into covered canals. These were the ancestors of modern sewers. Rudimentary, yes, but intentional. What's striking is that these systems weren't communal. They were private. Even 4,000 years ago, sanitation was a form of privilege. Meanwhile, in the Indus Valley, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were building something remarkable: standardized toilets. Almost every home had a small, raised brick platform with a hole and a vertical drain that led to a street-level sewer. These weren't accidents. They were planned. The sewage systems even had inspection covers and sediment traps. While Europe would still be dumping waste into the street centuries later, this ancient South Asian civilization was already managing urban sanitation on a grand scale. There was no flushing, no water pressure. Waste moved by gravity, by rain, or by hand. Someone had to clean it, and in every city, that task fell to the poorest, the unclean castes, the untouchables, the laborers who slipped into the dark tunnels of civilization and emerged, quite literally, covered in its consequences. In ancient Egypt, the rich had limestone toilet seats perched over sand-filled pots. These would be emptied by servants, usually at night. The poor went wherever they could. Even in the grand cities along the Nile, waste ran alongside water. The same river used for drinking and bathing carried away what people left behind. The pattern is clear. Wherever people gathered, toilets followed. Not out of convenience, but out of fear. Fear of disease, fear of neighbors, fear of one's own body. The earliest toilets weren't about privacy or comfort. They were about control, a way to remove the unpleasant from sight, smell, and memory. Even before flushing, people were already trying to flush something away. Something more than just waste. When people think of ancient toilets, they often picture Rome, grand, marble-seated latrines in open-air bathhouses, communal and echoing with conversation. And in a way, that's true. But it's also a carefully polished illusion, one that hides the filth behind the facade. Roman latrines were impressive to look at. Long benches of smooth stone lined the walls, each with oval openings carved at regular intervals. Below the bench, a continuous stream of water flowed, meant to carry away the waste. In front of the bench, a smaller gutter held another stream for rinsing the sponge on a stick, shared by everyone. Yes, shared. The tersorium, a communal sponge, was the Roman version of toilet paper. It was dipped into vinegar or salt water, used, and returned. Ancient graffiti complains of poor hygiene and rumors of disease, even as emperors praised the engineering marvels. Public toilets were more than functional. They were social, a place to sit, talk, and do your business among others doing the same. Privacy wasn't the point. Efficiency was. A well-placed latrine could serve dozens at once, but only if you could get there. Most Romans didn't have toilets at home. Apartment buildings, called insulae, were crowded, cramped, and had no plumbing. Residents used chamber pots and tossed their contents out the window, often with a shout of warning. Streets in Rome had open gutters, and waste flowed in the same direction as gossip, downhill and fast. The famed Cloaca Maxima, Rome's massive central sewer, carried rainwater and refuse out of the city into the Tiber River. But it wasn't built for feces. It was a storm drain. The idea that Rome had a modern sewage system is a myth. It had a system, but it was far from clean. And those marble latrines, mostly for soldiers, travelers, or wealthy patrons in bathhouses. The average Roman lived in a building with no facilities, surrounded by stench, trying to avoid stepping in last night's dinner. There were, of course, alternatives. The thunder jug, a ceramic pot kept under the bed, was common. So was the shared outhouse, if your building had one. But most people simply didn't have access to sanitation. To make it worse, ancient doctors believed that bad smells, miasmas, caused disease, and nothing smelled worse than human waste. So people burned incense, carried flowers, or wore amulets to ward off illness. They treated the symptom, not the source. And yet, Rome kept growing, kept thriving. The contradiction was stunning. One of the most advanced civilizations in history, living ankle-deep in human waste. The toilet, as an idea, was present. But as a solution, it still hadn't arrived. If the Romans flirted with sanitation, medieval Europe divorced it entirely. After the fall of Rome, the infrastructure collapsed, and with it, the fragile systems that kept filth at bay. What followed was a 1,000-year slide into darkness, both figurative and literal. And toilets? They became holes in the ground, again. In castles, the wealthy built garderobes, stone rooms jutting out over the moat or wall with a wooden seat and a vertical shaft. Waste dropped straight down. No cleaning, no pipes, just gravity. The idea was simple. Distance equals safety. But the moat, it often turned into a stagnant, reeking swamp. And the shaft walls? They needed scraping. In towns, the situation was worse. Most homes had no toilet at all. People used chamber pots and dumped them in the street, literally. Every morning, cities awoke to the sound of sloshing pots being emptied out of windows, followed by a warning cry, "Gardez-vous!" in Edinburgh, "Attention!" in Paris, or just a grunt and a splash in London. The streets were paved, but not for walking. Open gutters ran through the center, collecting rain, blood, animal guts, and human waste. These weren't sewers. They were rivers of rot, and people lived right beside them. There were attempts to regulate it. In 14th century Paris, city ordinances forbade dumping waste out of windows. In London, fines were imposed on those who fouled the public drains. But enforcement was weak. After all, where else could the waste go? Public latrines existed, but they were rare and usually poorly maintained. They stank, spread disease, and were often used as shelters by the poor. Many were built over rivers, so the flow could carry waste downstream, which meant someone else's drinking water became your toilet's destination. Monasteries were an exception. Some had rudimentary systems, rows of seats overflowing water, regularly flushed by diverted streams. But even these fell into disrepair over time. The spiritual cleanliness of the monks far outpaced their physical hygiene. For most people, privacy didn't exist. You relieved yourself where you could, behind a barn, near a wall, in a bucket. Smell wasn't something to be avoided. It was a constant. People believed that excrement itself wasn't dangerous, only the odors it released. So they covered smells with perfumes, herbs, and religious tokens. The Black Death changed little. Though disease swept through cities, the link between waste and sickness was not understood. If anything, people became more suspicious of cleanliness. Bathhouses were shuttered. Water was feared as a carrier of illness. And the toilet? It remained a crude hole, a pot, or a ditch. Human waste piled up, along walls, in courtyards, beneath floorboards. In some cases, entire families shared a single wooden box with a lid. In others, streets became so foul that shoes were invented with high platforms just to keep your feet dry. And through it all, the idea of the toilet regressed. From stone seats to wooden lids, from marble to mud. The dream of sanitation faded into the background, replaced by superstition and survival. The Middle Ages didn't just pause progress, they buried it, beneath layers of ash, waste, and forgetting. By the 16th century, the world was waking up, not to cleanliness, but to class. Toilets became more than places to relieve yourself. They became symbols of power, of privacy, of who mattered and who didn't. In Tudor England, aristocrats began building private outhouses called privies, often perched above cesspits or streams. These weren't communal, they were personalized. Small, enclosed rooms, sometimes carpeted, often perfumed. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly had a velvet-covered toilet seat. The waste still dropped into a pit, but at least the user didn't have to see it. For the poor, it was still chamber pots and alleyways. But the idea of privacy had begun to spread, slowly infecting the culture. The very word privy meant private. The toilet was becoming a room, a place to hide what had once been public. Across the Channel, in France, the garde-robe turned into the cabinet d'aisance, literally, the room of ease. These cabinets were tucked into corners of palaces, hidden behind tapestries or sliding panels. But they were still crude, a wooden hole, a stench-filled chute, and a servant to clean the mess. Servants were essential. They didn't just empty chamber pots. They became experts in discretion. In Versailles, the royal family had golden commodes, and behind them stood men with gloves and buckets. Entire jobs existed just to manage the bodily needs of the elite. Meanwhile, in cities like London, things were reaching a breaking point. The population exploded. The streets ran thick with waste. Cesspits, underground holes where excrement was stored, became standard. Every few weeks, a man called the night soil collector would arrive with a shovel and a cart, often at midnight, to dig out the human sludge. It was dangerous work. The fumes could knock you unconscious, the pits sometimes collapsed, and no one respected the job. These workers were invisible unless the stench followed them. And yet, they were crucial. Without them, cities would have drowned in their own filth. Then, in 1596, something changed. A man named Sir John Harington, godson to Queen Elizabeth I, built something radical, a flushing toilet. It had a seat, a cistern, and a system of levers and valves. You pulled a handle, and water from above washed the waste into a cesspit below. He even wrote a book about it, filled with metaphors and jokes. He called it A New Discourse Upon a Stale Subject. The Queen used it once, then ignored it. Because the problem wasn't invention, it was infrastructure. Flushing waste into a pit still meant someone had to empty the pit. And water? Clean water? Most people didn't have it in their homes. The flush was a fantasy. Elegant, clever, but ahead of its time. Still, the idea stuck. And over the next 2 centuries, engineers, inventors, and plumbers would race to make it real. The privy had cracked open the door. What came next would blow it off the hinges. The 19th century didn't just bring revolutions in industry, it brought one in the bathroom. For centuries, human waste had been everyone's problem and no one's responsibility. But now, for the first time in history, government stepped in, and toilets became a public mission. It started with death. In London, the River Thames stank. It was filled with every kind of refuse, industrial sludge, dead animals, and above all, human waste. The city's sewers were medieval at best, brick tunnels built to carry rainwater, not excrement. People still used chamber pots, which were dumped into cesspits or straight into the street. And when it rained, everything washed into the river, including cholera. From 1831 to 1866, London suffered multiple cholera outbreaks. Thousands died. The disease spread like fire, especially in poor neighborhoods. But no one understood why. Some blamed the air, miasmas, bad smells that supposedly carried disease. Others pointed fingers at the poor themselves. But one man had a different idea. Dr. John Snow, not the one from the north, noticed something strange. The cholera victims all drank from the same water pump. He removed the pump handle. The deaths stopped. He had found the answer. Water, not air, was the problem. Feces in the drinking supply. It was a revelation, but no one listened. Then came the Great Stink of 1858. That summer, the heat baked the Thames until it became unbearable. Parliament members had to soak curtains in lime just to keep from vomiting at their desks. Now the problem wasn't theoretical. It was nasal. It was political. And something had to be done. Enter Joseph Bazalgette. An engineer with a vision, Bazalgette proposed an enormous sewer system, over 1,300 miles of tunnels, carrying waste far from the city. It was ambitious, expensive, and brilliant. By 1875, much of it was complete, and it worked. The stink faded, the cholera outbreaks stopped, London was reborn. And alongside the sewers came something equally revolutionary, the modern toilet. Inventors had been tinkering for decades. Alexander Cumming in 1775 patented the S-bend trap, a curved pipe that kept sewer gases from rising back up. Thomas Crapper, yes, that's a real name, popularized the siphonic flush system. But the key wasn't just technology, it was mass production. Factories began producing ceramic toilets with ornate designs. They weren't just functional, they were fashionable. Homes were built with bathrooms as dedicated rooms. Running water became common, and with it, the toilet became a daily part of life. Still, not everyone joined the revolution at once. In rural areas, outhouses remained common. Poor households often shared a single latrine, and indoor plumbing was expensive. The toilet, though no longer a luxury, was still a marker of progress. Having one meant you were modern, civilized, clean. Governments began to regulate sanitation. Public health became policy. Plumbing codes were written. Septic tanks were introduced in the countryside. And suddenly, human waste had a home, a system, a direction. But the war wasn't over. Because as the toilet spread, it carried with it a hidden problem: water usage. Each flush sent gallons down the pipe. Multiplied by millions, it meant billions of gallons wasted every day. In solving one crisis, humanity had created another. Still, for the first time in history, people lived in cities where excrement didn't pile up in the streets, where children didn't die from waterborne disease, where the bathroom was no longer a site of shame, but of relief. The war on waste had turned into a victory, imperfect, leaky, but real. Today, you flush and forget. A push of a button, a swirl of water, and waste vanishes into the invisible arteries of civilization. But the story doesn't end there, because the future of the toilet might look less like porcelain and more like code, sensors, and sustainability. The 20th century brought toilets into nearly every home in the developed world. In Japan, they evolved into machines, washlets with heated seats, bidet functions, dryers, and even ambient music. Some models scan your urine, track your health, and upload the data to your phone. It's a toilet, but it's also a lab. In the West, progress focused more on aesthetics and efficiency. Low-flow models, dual flush systems, and pressure-assisted tanks emerged to save water. Green plumbing became the norm, but still, every flush sent drinkable water down the drain. And outside the developed world, the contrast is brutal. Over 3.5 billion people still live without safe sanitation. In some areas, people defecate in open fields. In others, shared latrines overflow into the streets. Children die from preventable diseases caused by dirty water. The toilet may be modern, but it's far from universal. So innovators are stepping in. In 2011, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation launched the Reinvent the Toilet Challenge. The goal? Create a toilet that doesn't require plumbing, electricity, or water. The results? Stunning. Solar-powered toilets that incinerate waste, chemical toilets that break down pathogens, microbiological systems that convert excrement into fertilizer, and even clean water. These aren't prototypes. They're already being deployed in slums, schools, and refugee camps. Meanwhile, in cities, the toilet is becoming smart. It tracks your bowel movements, it checks for cancer markers, it warns you of dehydration or infection, and it stores the data, for better or worse. The bathroom has become part of the data economy. But with progress comes new questions. Who owns your waste? Who sees your health data? Can a toilet be hacked? Is a smart bathroom still private? And then there's the culture. In some countries, bidets are normal. In others, they're taboo. In some homes, toilet paper is essential. In others, it's offensive. The design of the toilet may be universal, but the rituals around it are deeply personal, shaped by class, gender, religion, and history. One thing is certain: the toilet has never been just a seat. It's a mirror of who we are, what we value, and what we choose to ignore. Because even now, in a world of flush sensors and climate-controlled seats, some people still relieve themselves behind a bush, and others, trapped in cities without infrastructure, pray for a place to go. So, what comes next? Maybe toilets that clean themselves, maybe ones that compost, maybe no toilets at all, just systems that recycle and renew. But whatever shape they take, they will still serve the same ancient purpose: to separate waste from life. The story of the toilet is not about technology. It's about dignity, about drawing a line between what is sacred and what we choose to flush away. And in that line, we see the story of civilization itself.